If you're a producer, mix engineer, or even a musician, chances are you've considered adding analog gear to your setup. Now, one of the things I often hear is people thinking that analog gear can slow down and complicate your workflow. But is it really true? Well, in this video we're gonna answer that question, and I'll share my experiences of working with analog gear with you. To give you some context, let me quickly tell you how I got into the world of hardware. I started making music on a computer back in year 2000, I think. And I was using FL Studio, or as it was called at the time, Fruity Loops. Soon I switched to Reason. I think it was version 2.5 if I remember correctly. After a while I moved to Cubase, and ever since then it has been my go-to DAW for all my audio tasks. I purchased my first hardware in 2020, so for most of my career I relied only on plugins for production, mixing and mastering. And let me tell you something about me. I'm all about an efficient mixing workflow. So before getting my first hardware, I was a bit worried that it would slow down my mixing process. And spoiler alert, it did slow me down, but only in the beginning. After I learned my lesson, I was able to mix faster than ever before. My first devices were the SSL Fusion and the Heritage Audio 609A compressor, and my intention was to mix through them, specifically use them on the mix bus. It was as simple as connecting them to one of the outputs of my Apollo interface and then routing them back to one of the inputs. Since the Apollo X6 has 3 stereo outputs and inputs, there was no issue with connectivity. But I quickly fell in love with the sound I was hearing through these devices, and here it comes my first mistake. I reached a point where I not only wanted to use them on my mix bus, but also wanted to process subgroups and also the entire mix. This meant that I would start mixing using plugins, then when the mix was sounding good, I would process my groups, and finally I would work on the mix bus. Since I only had 2 devices, the only way to achieve this was by printing tracks to free up the hardware for reuse. And if I realized later that I wanted to change something, I had to go back, readjust the settings and print the tracks again. Honestly, it was a quite tedious process, but on the other hand, I loved the sound I was getting so much that I was willing to make that sacrifice. Plus, I had the feeling that I needed to process my mixes less to achieve the desired result. Nowadays, I wouldn't go back to that system because it's not very efficient. If I could give advice to my past self, I would say stick with your equipment for processing the mix bus and use them only for that purpose. And here comes my first lesson learned. If speed and efficiency are important to you, it's recommended to gradually add analog gear to your setup, each with its unique purpose. For example, one of the first things you can buy is an EQ and a compressor for the mix bus and use them only for that. Then you could consider, for example, getting an 1176 compressor for processing lead vocals, followed by a compressor specifically for bass, and so on. Now, it's true that working with analog hardware had its disadvantages. One thing that's not often talked about is the cabling, specifically if you're using a patch bay. It means that to connect one single stereo device, you need 8 cables. 2 from the interface to the patch bay, 2 from the patch bay to the device, 2 from the device to the patch bay, and finally 2 from the patch bay back to the interface. So, when you have multiple devices, it can become a bit of a cable mess. So you definitely have to consider managing the wiring in your studio. This requires some work and thinking, but if you want to work with analog gear and not get crazy with the mess, this is a must. But once you've sorted out that problem and have everything connected and ready to use, it won't really slow down your workflow, in my opinion. In fact, I believe it can actually speed things up. Firstly, because you can use your gear just like you would use plugin inserts. Secondly, you can achieve a professional result faster without relying on as many plugins. But I know what you're thinking. What about recalls? Isn't that like a nightmare? Well, if you're working with a 64-channel analog console and have 3 racks of hardware, the process might take longer compared to having just a few pieces of equipment. In my case, what I do is take photos of the devices with my phone and save them in my Notes app. Then when I open a session and set up my entire equipment, it takes me about 5 minutes of my time. In my opinion, those 5 minutes are worth it. In fact, even if it took me about 10 minutes, I would still say it's worth it. And let me tell you a secret I haven't told anyone. One of the reasons I got into analog gear is that I actually enjoy tweaking real knobs. It makes me feel like an audio engineer instead of a finance guy working with spreadsheets. Another important thing is that you don't have to change the settings of every device every time. For example, I have 2 1176 compressors that I use in parallel as a kind of distortion box. I rarely have to adjust their settings. The same goes for the 1176 I use on the lead vocals. I hardly ever have to tweak the settings. And speaking of settings and equipment, I have made a video where I describe my entire setup, including my analog gear and how everything is connected. Check it out, see you there.